Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this episode of the Codebreakers. Today we'll be going over 50 Shades and everything related to why this is so in our face and how it went from a serial on the web to a major motion picture. With me today are Gina, Stephanie, and Thomas, who I'd like to all say hello now. Gina?
Hi.
Stephanie?
Hey, everybody.
Thomas?
Hello and welcome.
So let's start with what 50 Shades is. And it's a trilogy, but we're only going to go over the first one because I'm not reading the other two. So, and it's a book about a graduating college student runs into a billionaire who likes it kinky, and them going through that together and trying to make it work. Fair enough?
Very well done. Good job.
Fair enough.
There's the synopsis. So I'll start with you, Thomas, because you just left. What about 50 Shades makes it worth talking about?
Well, what makes it worth talking about? First of all, to me, what fascinates me about this, and I know we're gonna unpack a whole bunch of this in the show, but one of the things that fascinates me about it is that it violated so many of the rules that normally are in place for marketing books. It was not particularly well written. It offended a lot of people. There was a lot of things that it had in place that would make you think that this should not take off at all, and yet it has managed to explode into one of the greatest bestsellers in recent history, and is now a motion picture and has had significant cultural influence as well. And so the big question that I guess we're here to explore today is, what the heck happened?
Well, I have a question for you, Thomas, because we've gone back and forth about this.
Okay.
A lot of the success that I've seen, a lot of the numbers I've seen about the success of the book itself are related specifically to sales on Amazon. So we're talking either Kindle, which is the quick and dirty way to get it, or someone sends it to your house in a brown box. So what do you think the contribution of the fact that you can buy it anonymously, as opposed to having to walk into the bookstore and pick it up off the shelf and give it to somebody who sees that you're reading it, does that contribute to the virality and to the fact that it was, the fact that it was so easy to access? Did that make it easier for people to buy?
Well, I think that's such a great question. So let me share my thoughts with you on that on two parts. First of all, I do think that this medium dramatically impacted its reach, because a lot of the major numbers you are seeing, as you pointed out, were on Amazon. And you had brought this up to me before, and I went back and tried to track down the numbers in terms of print, and I couldn't find solid numbers anywhere that I was able to look at. And in fact, I haven't been able to really find solid book sale numbers on this since 2012. 2012 was where its Amazon UK sales exceeded that of Harry Potter on Amazon again. But since then I haven't been able to really track down solid numbers on the book, but I do consistently see it showing up on major lists. But it is worth noting that in the genre that it took off in, which is this erotic romance genre, was one of the leaders in, was one of the first adopters of the e-publishing style, and so had been really engaged with that. And so we do see other books within this genre that had the same access to those distribution models, and yet, and in many cases were better written, but still have not been able to catch the same sort of virality, the same sort of reach that this one has. So I do think that contributed, but I think that there were other factors that allowed that to contribute as well.
Yeah, and even prior to that, because it began as fan fiction with the Twilight series, it began online before it was even established who the author was and before it gained its current title as well. So it already had this huge momentum force behind it before it became a published book in the name of 50 Shades of Grey. So it had a head start.
I would argue that that controversy was what sprung it past. That it was Twilight fan fiction that was not condoned, it was rejected, it was the shunning of it as such is what helped push it into the book and beyond. What would you think about that?
Well, I was just going to say maybe we should clarify for people who don't know the whole history. And I'm not an expert. I think Thomas, maybe you did some research on this. But the book started out as different characters, right? It was the characters from the Twilight series who were originally the stars of this story. So I don't know, Thomas, you want to tell us a little more about that?
Well, it began as I understood it. Now, keep in mind, I didn't read it as that version. This is just when I went back and tried to backtrack as to where this started and how this came out. It did start as fan fiction based around Twilight, and it was published in a very similar format on the Twilight fan fiction website, and it got significant. It had a significant reaction there. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I remember that there was a significant viewership on that website until they pulled it because this is a young adult fan fiction site, and those are a little bit more adult themes, right? So they took it there, and then it was about a year later where it was republished on E.L. James' own site, I think it was 50shades.com or something like that. It's republished there. Then it was eventually, so we actually see an evolution. Then that was eventually published with a small independent publisher in Australia. Who had designed the cover and released it there, began to gain some traction and controversy there, and then Vintage Books came along, purchased the rights to it from that publisher, and then re-released it again with a new cover, and that's where we get the cover with the tie, and the subsequent sequels, the mask, and the handcuffs. But so we do also see an evolution of this, but in each place we see there's a little bit more growth and a little more controversy and then a little more growth until eventually you wind up hitting Vintage Books, takes it, and after that it just blew up.
Yeah, and there was a second level of controversy after the controversy that occurred on the Twilight site, and that's that people assumed that E.L. James stole the book from the Twilight when it was called Master of the Universe, and her name at that point was like Snow something or other.
Snow Queen's Ice Dragon.
Yeah.
It was Snow Queen, and she wrote The Master of the Universe, and when she switched it over to clear ownership of her own, then there was a whole nother level of dispute. So all these things are adding up all along the way to create interest.
Yeah. One thing that I have always wondered about is how everybody heard about it, right? Because we've talked about this before, but it doesn't feel like something at the beginning where the marketing campaign itself is what sold you on the book, right? Like the way I heard about it was I'm in a book club, and there was a whole you had book club against book club. We read it, we didn't. We're not gonna read it. We might read it. But it was this very personal thing, this group of moms or this group of ladies who wanted to get together, and they were trying to decide whether they were going to read it. And so it's interesting that we talk about the marketing and the controversy, but it feels almost like a grassroots kind of growth.
I agree. I think it definitely feels like that. The word of mouth, kind of hush hush. Did you read it?
Whisper, whisper.
I'm not gonna read it, but actually I want to read it. I want to, and that whole mystique. That's a really powerful thing.
Well, you were part of. I mean, those who read it were sort of part of the inside, like the naughty club. right? Because, oh my goodness, you can't read this book. But if you did, and you knew other people that had read the book, you kind of had like this inside thing going on. I do think my experience was I knew other people that had read it, and they had introduced me, and to me it seemed curious, and I was wondering why this was so engaging, which is why I grabbed it and read it. But it was other people. But I also think that there had to come a certain saturation point, at which point the marketing winds up being surpassed, and usually that's like that tipping point is like one of the goals in marketing, right? When the word of mouth has been fueled enough that it surpasses the actual marketing efforts, and that's where things really began to take off. And so, but there was a lot going on by the time that saturation took place, both in terms of controversy in particular, but also in terms, I think, of curiosity and some of these pitting against other things, that was able to fuel conversation around this topic.
Let's take a swing and look at the buttons that the work itself pushes and how that contributes, that makes it worth something you'd talk about to your friends or your book club. Anybody want to take that ball?
I'll start. I mean, obviously the big one is that it talks about sex, right? We've talked about this before, that's one of the principal triggers, or one of the 4 Fs as we call it. But clearly the main subject matter in this book is not the romantic relationship between the 2 characters. It's the physical relationship, the sexual relationship that they have. And so I think that the importance of that aspect in the book, like you said, Thomas, really kind of created this dividing line. Do I want to talk about it that openly, or do I not? And so it made it very easy for that to be a trigger, and to use all kinds of different mechanisms for people to get pressured into reading it. Like, oh, come on, you can't be that lame. Come on, it's just a book. It's not that big of a deal, So you kind of had people who, you had a built-in controversy, I guess is what I'm saying, because the sexual content of the book was so blatant.
And it wasn't just sexual content, it was the particular kind of sexual content, and the danger aspect and the forbidden quality of that. And I think that the romance and that aspect of the story actually does play into it, because it kind of helps to support the forbidden aspects of the sexual relationship for so many readers, that she is trying to change him. They have this whole humor thread going through their relationship. There's a lot of play, and that helps people to kind of feel more comfortable with what's really going on.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, let's be honest, that there was that when we talk about this polarizing aspect of it and sort of the controversy that brings, that works on both ends, because we have on the one hand those people who are like, well, I'm not going to stand against it, so I'm going to go read it because I'm sort of the goody-goody outside group. But then you also have the other group that says, something is wrong here, we need to take a stand against it, but we have to know what we're taking a stand against, so let's all read it, right? So you have, so the other side grabs that and begins reading it as well. So either side, so that controversy fuels that. It's either side that you're on, and that controversy took place on multiple layers. And this was something that I think was really interesting about it, is that on the one hand you have like a conservative, a fairly conservative group that says, sexual relationship is a very unhealthy sexual relationship, and we can't allow this to be popularized. We've got to take a stand against it. So you get this kind of controversy over here. On the other hand, I think James was attempting, at least, to try to present some sort of lifestyle within the BDSM community, but the BDSM community says, no, that's not what this is about. So you get controversy over here, right? Particularly when we get into areas where they are where they have like gone through all of the negotiations to establish a contract, and then like the next scene, he throws the contract out, right? Which is a huge violation within that community. So now those who might otherwise embrace the book are faced with controversy as well. And so this targeted controversial areas all over the place. It wasn't just, well, is more risque sex okay or not? It was, regardless of where you fell in that spectrum, there was some aspect of controversy to tap into.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that continued. I mean, if you wanted to be cynical about it, you could say they did it on purpose, but that continued even with the making of the film, right? Mm-hmm. Because they had the film, they came out, they announced the stars, and then all of a sudden, oh no, the lead character has to pull out. Yeah, sorry, bad thing to talk about. Has to.
Well played.
No, I can't come up with the right word, but he's no longer in the film. How about that? And then then they have to go through the whole, okay, who's going to be the new star, and is he going to be sexy enough, and I forget what her name, Dakota.
No.
Whoever it is, I don't remember the lead character, whoever plays Anna, is she going to have the same chemistry? So instead of it just being the film is coming out and let's get interested in what the film's going to be, the whole discussion becomes, is the film even going to get made, right? So then it creates more anticipation. And again, you don't want to believe that they did it on purpose, but it certainly made the film a lot more anticipated because it took longer, but also because there was all this controversy around the film itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's interesting because so if we go back to the initial question that was raised, what are some of the buttons on here? We talked about sex being that, and now so that is one of the that's the fornication, right? We have, but that also taps into how that has spurred controversy and this polarizing, which ties into sort of that fight or flight thing. You either say, I'm going to, fight this book, I'm going to fight for this book, I'm going to flee this book, whatever. So there's that sort of trigger. And I think, in my opinion, I think that was the big differentiation point that pushed us over the edge. But the other thing that we have that is that you were commenting earlier, Stephanie, is part of most romances is this provision aspect. We call it food in the 4 Fs, but this idea that that the needs are met, that there is some sort of materialistic aspect to this, and that was very prevalent in this book. The billionaire and all those type of things. How do you see that tying in with the sort of the connection point the people have made with either for or against the story, but the way that has fueled that?
Well, I think it's interesting because in one respect it is very standard stock. It's kind of like we said, the typical thing, really rich hot guy helps poor young girl, and so the story is not that different. But I do think that the focus on the power that material that his material comfort provides to Christian, the fact that he is so used to everybody doing exactly what he says when he says, really feeds into, again, this cross between fantasy and reality. Because I think everybody knows, or at least imagines that they know somebody who has a ton of money who nobody says no to. And so it goes from being this fantasy, this guy is great and he's wonderful and he's going to provide for me, to being, he's entitled to all of this because of the fact that he is so powerful and so wealthy. And it kind of twists it a little bit from the let me take care of you, and tilts it more towards the you have to do what I say. Kind of playing into his obsession. And I want to hear Gina's take about this, because I think that's where the balance of power in the relationship starts to get interesting in the book, because he's completely obsessed. And so although it looks like he's the one with all the power, he's not at all the one with all the power, because he's desperate for her. Now, desperate for her is a relative term, but I don't know, Gina, what's your take on that? Is it the material possessions, or is it more the emotional relationship?
Well, I think that the material possessions and his wealth set him up for the emotional connection in so many ways. I mean, and that is the standard, the classic romance story, you know, whether it's power because he's older, whether it's power because he's the boss, whether it's power because he's rich, it all sets up the potential for coercion. And it also sets up the attraction to the audience for wanting to engage with the story, because it fulfills a fantasy that's just so universal that we've always had. You know, who doesn't want to be taken care of on some level, right? Men and women. Everybody's got needs. So if he can supply certain kinds of needs, and then he can also supply the emotional need, which is what she's after, that's when she's always saying, I want more, I want more. She wants that emotional need fulfilled as well. But because he is a wounded soul and has been abused, he also needs to create that kind of control in his life, which is part of why he becomes a dominant and part of why he has the motivation and the drive to become wealthy and have so much stuff and so much power. So in a way, that's sort of the only halfway decent bit of character development, or consistent bit. I'll say not decent, but consistent bit of character development, because it sets up the potential for coercion, which is what I think so much of it is about. But you're right, he is obsessed with her. He's constantly saying, you've bewitched me, you've bewitched me, and that gives her a sense of power, and he's always saying, you're the powerful one. It gets, as you can see, I mean, it's like every single piece that you recognize and everything that you say or one says leads to yet another viewpoint and another aspect. So there's this constant building upon the intrigue. And for me, that's part of what made the thing go viral too. You know, it's feeding all of the 4 Fs, but it's also stimulating so much questioning and dialogue within any educated or intelligent person that reads the book, I think. And so many of the articles written about it, there's a lot of grit.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's worth pointing out that, and this is just theoretical, but one of the major criticisms against the book, apart from sort of the controversial aspects, one of the recurrent criticisms is the quality of writing in it, and which you just touched on, the fact that there is very little characterization on either one. Stephen King, when he was interviewed, was talking about this, and he said Anastasia has 2 responses. If she likes something, she says, oh my, and if she doesn't like it, she says, oh God, and that's kind of like the depth of her, you know, her personality in the book. But by the same virtue of that, this book, and really this genre, but this book in particular, tends to target the fantasies that people have, the sexual fantasies that maybe they're unwilling to explore, uncomfortable exploring, or having a glimpse into another sort of fantasy world. It feeds this sort of a fantasy, and in the process of feeding these fantasies, it creates characters that are empty shells. And so you can read yourself into the character because there isn't anything there preventing that, which fuels the fantasy further and reinforces each of those 4 Fs, the food, fornication, fight or flight, and then ultimately you'll forget it.
Well, and something that's interesting to me is, we talked about this a little bit in the green room, how much of that is pre-existing, right? How much of that is just the way people see things, and how much of that is actually teaching people to see partners in that way. Right. This is where it starts to become a really interesting debate, and where I think some of the continuing controversy comes from, because it's one thing to say, I recognize that people are very stereotypical in their fantasy life, right? And that they, in their fantasy life, want a partner who always says yes, or who's willing to try something new or whatever. And so I write a piece of, I write a work that represents that. But at what point does continuing to write a work that does that perpetuate the stereotype, or even take that fantasy over into reality and say, okay, well, you know what? I've read 15 books. And this must just be the way people are, because in every single book, this is how they are. So if my real life doesn't mimic what's in the book, there must be something wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's the problem with media in general. And we've had that conversation on so many of these shows, what we call the princess shows, and we talk about that all the time. And this is one of the issues that the BDSM community has with the book, that it's so clean and so ultimately safe, and so there's no the reality is so polished.
You're talking about the BDSM community is clean
Yes.
and safe and polished, not the book. Just to clarify.
So the BDSM community feels that the way this was portrayed in the book was overly clean, unrealistic, and not true. It's they've got the same complaint that any community would have about it, because it's so surface, and Stephen King included. So she's not, in a way, revealing any true realities. It's
Right.
it's all fantasy,
Mm-hmm.
in every area.
Mm-hmm. Well, and she targets, I mean, the other thing is that some of those core areas that are of vital importance to those communities, she undermines in some ways. So
Yes.
one of the most sacred aspects to the BDSM community is that what we do is safe. When they lay this out, they have interactions that they set the boundaries very clearly in the negotiations for what is and is not acceptable behavior. They have safe words that they apply. They make sure that in every instance that things are safe and that people are protected, and that's part of that is important, because the book took away those safeguards.
Yeah, the boundaries, they were bleeding through the boundaries. And also, one of the other criticisms from that community was that there was really no relationship deeply established prior to going into the playroom. And that is considered to be very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
But that's classic for this kind of novel, when things just happen so quickly and without any kind of depth.
Right.
And that was one of their complaints, because that would not be safe.
Right, which brings us back to some of that fantasy element, and I think we want to talk about it in just a moment. But I saw a question come up. Stephanie,
From Alex.
Yeah,
From
actually,
Alex.
Alex had a couple of questions, but I think this one is relevant to what we're talking about. She says, is it her, I think she's talking about the author's, responsibility to reveal true realities, or is it our responsibility to accept the fantasy as a fantasy? And I think this is where the whole distinction between a viral phenomenon that kind of penetrates the culture. I gotta quit saying stuff.
You said you weren't going to say that word.
I know, I said I wasn't going to say it on top of that. That's so funny.
It's really funny.
That is very funny. Freudian slip, I guess.
We'll
I don't
talk
know
about that later.
Yeah, we'll have a whole conversation after.
Yes.
But I forgot what I was saying. Oh, the question of at what point does the cultural impact or just the prevalence of the phenomenon start to change people's everyday lives, instead of being a reflection of what a certain segment of the population believes? At what point does it actually change the direction? Right.
It's a loop. Exactly.
Right. And we talked about this a little bit in the green room right before we started, but there's an aspect to storytelling as well that deliberately it creates fantasies that allow for a willful suspension of disbelief, right? So even if we have something as wildly exotic as dragons and wizards, we create it in such a way that it becomes believable. And it's up to us to determine, to separate fantasy and reality. And often when we see fantasies in literature, we create something that can even challenge or shift the framework of how we perceive ethics, how we perceive behaviors. The example that I gave at the beginning was Jack and the Beanstalk, where we have a young boy who's poor, who creates a beanstalk, breaks into a giant's kingdom, steals the most valuable artifacts in the kingdom, and as the king giant tries to stop him, he slays the giant. So we have a thief and a murderer, and we have made the thief and the murderer the hero, and the one who's being robbed has become the villain, and we accept that because that's the way the story's framed. And we can separate that from reality very easily. The challenge sometimes with some of the books like this is that they parallel reality so clearly, where sometimes people have difficulties drawing those lines. And so when this is read, and I do agree with Alex, I do think the responsibility is on us as a reader to be able to differentiate between fantasy and reality. But I also think that people sometimes have a difficult time with that, and they read a fantasy and they say, "Oh, this is a great fantasy. I want to bring this fantasy into my world." And so we see the things like as a result of this book, we see a major increase in the sales of sex toys. We see a major increase in the sales of BDSM paraphernalia. We suddenly see sex toys and things like that are now being branded. You know, these are the 50 Shades toys, right? So we suddenly see that feedback loop where people are taking the fantasy and bringing it into reality, and reality is responding to that and reinforcing the fantasy, and the feedback loop that Stephanie was talking about a moment ago is fueled off of that because this parallels reality closely enough that we can read it and we can say, well, you know, maybe that doesn't have to be fantasy, maybe we can bring that into the real world, which creates challenges and has also fueled some of the pushback that we see from different communities, I think.
I just have a question for you, Thomas, though. Is that not part also of what made it so viral?
Oh, I think it is part of what made it viral. I mean, I think those are, yeah, absolutely.
And that's where it's difficult, right? Because you can look at something like the Harry Potter series. Now, totally different audiences, okay? Agreed. Mm-hmm. But there are things that are so blatantly fantasy but so well crafted that they become popular because of the quality of the world that they've created, mm-hmm. right? But the world is so different from ours. That's one way to go about it. But this, I think, is much closer to reality, and because it was so easy for someone to imagine themselves in the story, it was very tempting for them to be part of it. Mm-hmm. And then adding on the other triggers that we've talked about, you know, I don't know that we've talked about fear specifically, but I think a big part of this was fear of missing out, you know, which we've talked about before. Yeah. Like you said, you either read it or you didn't, and you needed to know which camp you were in. It was clear, because everybody had an opinion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and even with the Harry Potter, and I mean, we were talking 50 Shades, so you didn't do the research in Harry Potter, but I can tell you anecdotally, that obviously connected with a lot of people, and I can think offhand, I can think of at least 3 people that I know that have Harry Potter tattoos, right? Like, because the Deathly Hallows tattoos, because something about that to them was culturally significant. And in the conversation when I asked them why, at least one of them explained to me that this was one of the defining things of, of her life growing up, because she's in college now, but that this series was functionally shaping, and so that has led to those type of things. So even there, I think that there's an aspect of connecting with fantasy stories that winds up finding ways to bleed over into real life, or we try to find ways to incorporate that into our life.
Yeah, and there, there's another piece to this that we haven't mentioned yet, which is that there's a whole faction that feels and believes that this book enabled women to explore their sexuality more freely, that it was actually giving permission. And come to think of it, I'm seeing Ammon's comment here. Do you think when Lady Chatterley's Lover was the shocking book, everyone talked about the demand for gardening services went up? No, but I do
bring it up. I didn't see it.
A lot of women were empowered reading that book and
right.
and did discover a greater freedom in their own choice making. And so there has been, that even perhaps that's a great example perhaps for why there are people that feel that this has been an empowering vehicle for women, this book. And it's fascinating to me that opinion even exists.
Well, Gina, do you think that the argument there is more along the lines of, by making it safe to have a conversation, you'll get people having the conversation who wouldn't have before, and that's always a good thing?
In that light, absolutely, but I'm not sure that the people that are having those thoughts are taking it where you just took it. I think it's more about what people feel comfortable doing in the privacy of their bedrooms, in their own homes. I don't know that part is being discussed, or it may not be as candidly or truthfully being discussed. The issue was this book helps this woman to feel more comfortable exploring her interest in being dominated. And I'm not sure she's necessarily sharing that with her girlfriends. I mean, I guess she could be. But then you get that whole, it's that same, trying to feel other people out to figure out what their position is and how far does that go or not.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that, because since this was kind of a grassroots phenomenon that started, I don't know if it started, but that ended up at least in a lot of book clubs, the argument to me is exactly what you're saying. You might have been talking about it, but you weren't talking about it with the right person. You're talking about it with your girlfriends, not with your significant other.
Good
right?
point.
If the goal of this book was to get people to be more open about their desires in their personal relationship, well, the person you need to be talking to is your partner, not your girlfriends over margaritas.
Mm-hmm. Right. And and it's also been labeled as mommy porn, and then because it started in the Twilight fan fiction arena, that was sort of the preteen, teen version of romance, and then this is more for middle-aged women, supposedly. And you had brought this up earlier about the desire to stay young and the nostalgia for looking back to our early 20s, because she's just graduated from college, and that was a long time ago for me and for
me too.
all of us. Yeah. So it's kind of this rekindling of a certain longing for that kind of romantic falling in love, obsession, addiction thing that everybody has had instilled in them in one way or another in our culture. So that is something that already exists in our culture, and then this is feeding it to this, it's pushing it to that more dangerous edge. And what our question earlier about how it then in turn affects the culture and starts to reshape the culture. Well, now it's allowed to discuss BDSM in public, where it may not have been previously.
I mean,
so in a way, we gained a component to our conversation that really, by all rights, ought to be there. That, why not, right?
But
I'm in constant argument with myself even as I think these things through, because the two sides are so opposing.
Well, and is it fair to say, I won't generalize this across the board, because quite honestly, I've heard some arguments in favor of the way that this frees women up sexually that I think are just absolutely ridiculous, and I've heard some arguments on the other side that say this is horrible, which I also think are ridiculous. But I've heard good arguments on both sides as well, and I think oftentimes it's almost like there's two different conversations going on, because within you got a group over here that says that this frees women up sexually to be able to explore things in a new way, and they're not usually talking about sort of the emotional and psychological manipulation of that Christian Grey is doing. They're usually talking about the way that there's another aspect to sexuality that maybe has been unexplored that now we're becoming more aware of and can be explored. And on the flip side, those that are opposed to it usually are pointing to the sort of coercion and emotional manipulation and psychological manipulation that Christian Grey is doing, which is, if not abusive, is certainly borderline abusive.
Yeah.
So,
and that's where my heart goes with it. I mean, that's the conversation that's just automatically there for me, and it's all the reading that I've done about the book that's kind of shown me these other viewpoints. Jenny Trout wrote a really good piece on the book, and I just love her stuff. There are people who think that the book is anti-feminist, or that the criticism is anti-feminist, and she's pointing out both sides of the coin there. And sorry, I just talked myself into a corner. I'll let you speak now, Stephanie.
I think we have a question coming up, actually, if I'm seeing this one here.
Yeah, I think that's Ammon's question, which is a really good one that says, is this increasing dependence upon identification with the storytelling and narratives of others, like the Hollywood epic style, a sign of dissatisfaction with our own lives and our own narratives? So it's kind of what we were touching on before, but is it a symptom of what's really happening, meaning people are just so unhappy with their own lives that we have to go out and find these ideals or these stereotypes or whatever because we're so unhappy with our own lives? Or are these stereotypes that we're being presented and almost being shoved down our throats making us dissatisfied with our lives?
Well, I think it's both. And humans have always used story as a way of imagining what could be, imagining what's possible, and as entertainment, and as for revealing lessons or morality play. So we're really familiar with the use of storytelling to define us and to also help us to picture a way that we can grow or increase our happiness and our comfort. So I think that it's doing both, and I'm not sure that either or can be pulled out and separated. They're both intrinsic to the other.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think that there is a complexity to that, because, I mean, if we're going to be honest, every one of us has areas of our life that we're very proud of, very satisfied with, very happy about, and areas of our lives where we are dissatisfied with and we're looking to improve or looking to change or just not happy with. I mean, that's part of the nature of human existence, is that we have things that we are very pleased with and happy with, and things that we are very unhappy with, or at least unsatisfied with, and the balance of that kind of allows us to arrive at a point where we're either satisfied with our lives because more of the things that are happening we are happy with, or we're dissatisfied. But I think that there's a mix, and I think that books like this can sometimes target into some of those, particularly when you consider that in our culture, it's really only in fairly recent history where conversations about sex in general. I don't just mean BDSM. I mean conversations about sex in public. Period. It's only really been within recent history where that's even socially acceptable. So now having something that not only brings this to a new level and is deliberately pushing boundaries, which is why it was so controversial, I think. I mean, aside from some of the dangerous things, so I shouldn't say that, but it also brings in an aspect of conversation where there hadn't been conversation previously, which opens up areas that are probably unexplored for many readers.
Yeah, so it's got a positive impact in that sense. I mean, we're having this conversation because of this book that we may think is trash. So we can find something positive in the scenario here.
Well, and it's interesting because it has provoked a lot of discussions. We talked about in book clubs and things like that. If what it's done is help someone feel comfortable talking about it, even if they just start talking about it with their girlfriends, maybe that overall is a really good thing, because then they'll eventually work up the courage to talk about it with their partner. I guess the question is, I was just, as you were talking, Thomas, I was thinking about, totally unrelated, but terrorism. For example, terrorism was not necessarily a hot topic that a lot of people talked about in the U.S., up until we had a cultural event that made it come to the forefront. But I'm not convinced that necessarily, that discussion has been productive, right? Kind of 15 years down the road, 14 years down the road, I'm not sure that the fact that we made it into such a big deal, it was a very big deal, I'm not at all saying it wasn't, but the fact that it dominated the conversation for such a long time, I don't know that that necessarily helped us progress in a way that was healthy. So I guess the jury's still out for me about this. Is it good that we're talking? Yes. Is it necessarily going to get us to a better place? I'm not sure.
Yeah. And there are different levels of coercion. There's coercion potentially in every even healthy relationship. Mm-hmm. So any kind of vehicle for getting us to look at where our positions are in all of our relationships, not just with our significant other, but any kind of power kind of dynamic is helpful to be examining. But I don't imagine that the millions of people that purchased and read this book are necessarily thinking about any of that. I mean, I don't think we should take that for granted at all. Well, and most people are reading it because they think it's fun and it fulfills something in them that they haven't even necessarily identified.
And a lot of people don't even understand the nature of power dynamics when it comes to sexual relationships and how that relates to coercion, which is, for example, I pastor a church. If I were to have a sexual relationship with somebody in my congregation, I can be legally charged with that because the power dynamic between myself and them makes their ability to offer consent diminished. So right. The same thing with psychiatrists and their patients, right? Because at least on a legal level, it's recognized that those sort of power relationships diminish the capacity for giving consent to a point where they can actually be legally charged for that. And those type of conversations typically, or even awarenesses, typically are not taking place on sort of the general level.
Yeah, and so many people, the whole argument about if this is rape or not, and so many people talk about this being a mutually consensual relationship, and they are skipping over the coercion and the power aspect there. Mm-hmm. And Stephanie, you have a story that you found that you might want to share, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, well, and this is where I think it's a two-edged sword. The jury's still out, but yet there's actually been a case where someone sexually assaulted someone, his girlfriend, in fact, someone he had known before, and then claimed that her refusal was just part of a 50 Shades type of game. And so that, yes, I heard her say no. Of course I heard her say no. She told me to stop, but we were just enacting the book. So you can't charge me with anything. This was a totally consensual act. And so then, of course, what that does is, particularly in a younger population, college-age kids, or even, women under, say, 25 who don't have a ton of experience, then the fear of not only do I have the courage to say no, but will he believe me? You've kind of added a second layer onto the dynamics of the relationship, which puts a ton of weight on the female in the partnership. And so then, I'm not sure that that's going to necessarily get us to healthier relationships if there's that kind of fear factor hanging over someone's head all the time.
And that's basically saying you have no power no matter what your words are.
Right.
I'm curious. Do you know what happened with that case? I mean, when you did the research on that, did that defense work, or was he?
I haven't seen it. I don't know that it's gone to trial yet, but I will put the links. I will put the links into the event. I don't think it's gone to trial because it was from early this year, if I remember correctly. I think it was a case from like February.
I would be very interested to see how that is responded to as well, because we've seen people use all sorts of I mean, that for a long time it was video games, right? If I shot somebody, it was because I was acting at Grand Theft Auto. So we've seen some of those things. I would be very interested to discover how people respond to that, because I also think that response is going to be very indicative of sort of the impact that this book has had on the culture that is determining some of these things.
Right. I mean, if this person is able to get a jury of 12 people to agree that yes, no meant yes, that starts to be concerning. It makes me scared for my girls, that's for sure.
Yeah. I like to think that's not going to happen.
Right. As well.
Well, and I think maybe that's ultimately we've covered a lot of ground about why this went viral, and we're kind of jumping on to the impacts, which we don't fully know yet, of what it's going to be in its next iteration. But I don't know. I think maybe we should talk a little bit about what it is that we took away from the book, and if it's going to make any changes in the way that we interact with people, or if it just kind of was one of those, like you said, Gina, yeah, I read it, it was interesting, now I'm moving on. So I don't know. Thomas, do you want to start with kind of what you took away?
Well, sure. Well, one of the things and part of the reason that this phenomenon intrigued me, the book actually had a positive impact on me in this way. And I read the book, and this book was becoming part of, I read it because it was becoming such a cultural conversation piece. But that also allowed me to begin having conversations with people that are part of the BDSM community, and which is outside my typical scope of people that I interact with, and so I like being able to engage across that because it teaches me new stuff. But it was interesting to me to learn from them what dominance is, as opposed to what the book portrays it is, what it often is in their circles, which is usually, a lot of times it's usually a female that's a submissive, although it's not always, but oftentimes it's a female that is very much in control of everything else in her world, and that becomes an aspect, a safe place to release control where she doesn't have to do that, and so and that's why that safety becomes so central. So for me, the ability that this is going to connect other people to have conversations that wouldn't have been there otherwise, and to learn about different subcultures has been very beneficial. But I also think that there are, because of the way that things are portrayed in the book, there's the flip side to that as well, that people at some level need to be aware of also.
Yep.
Who could say it better than that? I think that was a great wrap up. I've been really curious, obviously, about the feminist aspects here, and what actually empowers women and what doesn't. And so the arguments have to do with being able to have this subject on the table and allowing a woman to write a book like this and not call her anti-feminist. But then there's the whole aspect of the rape culture and coercion, and that it's okay, it paints a portrait that it's okay to step into a man's world that every bit of your instinct is telling you not to. I mean, throughout the book, even, she doesn't want this, and she keeps moving forward with him. And I still have some pages left to read. It was very slow, sloggy, unhappy read for me because I found it so boring and hard to get through. But it is raising a lot of really interesting questions for me. And in myself, what's been so interesting is my own ability to kind of bounce back and forth between, well, what is my opinion? I'm almost so open-minded, and finding myself to be so open-minded about the negative aspects and the positive aspects. Terrible writing, all that aside, just put that aside. It's not literature, and I don't like it because it's not literature. But it's been really a great experience for me to read all of these articles and to see all the different sides, and to read comments from the BDSM community and get a greater understanding there. And I agree with you on that, Thomas. I don't have anybody that I'm talking to personally in that regard, but it's been a learning experience for me, and so I do not regret reading it, even though I've hated reading it, and that's fascinating in itself. I just find that really, I don't often say that about anything, so that, you know.
Well, and I think that's kind of a unique perspective, right, Gina? It's something that we would hope, and even what Thomas said, it's something that we would hope people would be able to do, right? Not be so so close to the content of the book itself that they were able to kind of open themselves up to new ideas or to go and research things that that they found interesting, even if they didn't particularly love the book. The one thing, there was a comment from Ammon, who was talking about this need to go along with the crowd, right? It feels more and more like part of what's happening is nobody wants to talk about the elephant in the room. And so one thing I liked about this book was, even though there was a ton of pressure to be part of one camp or the other, with a little bit of finesse, you were able to get people to talk to you about their opinions. At least I was, right? Mm-hmm. And so it was a great tool, if you will, to get people to open up. And I really appreciated that about the book, even though I did not find it, you know, it didn't change my life. It wasn't an amazing read, but it was great, like Gina said, to have read the book, to have had the experience, because what it does is it gives you a basis for conversation. But you have to be really careful, because if you're on the bandwagon of my way is the only way and I want to be with the people who liked it because that's where I feel comfortable, then what you end up doing is getting maybe used by the marketing of the book as opposed to using it for your own benefit and being able to learn something from it. So when I look at the experience, that's kind of what I take away from it. And of course, I will warn all my girls never to date a guy named Christian Grey. That right. Clearly, we know that's happening. So.
And you know what? I just was thinking, listening to you, wouldn't it be so incredible if somebody who actually was a great writer would write the story? You know, do a well done version. That would be real. That would be fascinating. You know, because the quality of the book definitely affects our reaction to it so much as big readers. You know, and yep. If it were more complex and more layered and some of these questions actually entered into the telling of the story, what a cool book that could be. So somebody, I'm putting out the challenge. Go for it.
Who do we know that's an author that might want to take it on? We'll have to think about it and ping them.
We will.
The 50 Shades Challenge, hashtag.
And it won't go viral. I don't think it would go viral. I think the virality relied on the lower level of quality, which we didn't discuss at all, come to think of it, and now we
touched on that when we were talking about your ability to read yourself into the book because of the fact that these were just shells of characters.
So
we're not
right, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, we have come to the end of an hour. We were worried about the time, but look, it worked out great. And so I want to say thank you very much to Gina for being here. Thank you, Thomas, for being here. Thank you, Grim, for being here. And do you guys have any closing thoughts before we say goodbye, or are we ready to take it out?
I think we just did I just did my closing thought.
Okay. That's kind of what I thought, but I just wanted to check. Last time I was at the end of a show, I cut somebody off, so I just want to make sure.
Don't cut me off, because I'll spank you.
Ooh. Uh-oh. Okay, nobody's coming to the red room. Graham, you have to shut us down so Gina and I can get to the red room.
We're just going to the green room, not the red room.
No, it's a joke, Gina. The red room is
go, right?
The red room is after show. The green room is pre-show, and the red room is after show.
See how naive I am? Yeah. I think of it all as the green room, so.
Gotcha.
That's cool. Thanks, everyone, for watching, and we will catch you guys next time on the Codebreakers.
Bye.